There's a standard cliche, which I'm sure you have all heard, that if you have two economists in one room, you are bound to have at least three opinions. The subject I'm going to talk about today, however, is one subject with respect to which that is not true. With respect to the area of international trade, with respect to the question of whether it is desirable for a country to have free trade or to have tariffs and other restrictions on imports and exports, in that particular area, economists have spoken with almost one voice for some 200 years. Ever since the father of modern economics, Adam Smith, published his great book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, the same year in which the Declaration of Independence was issued in this country, ever since then, the economics profession has been almost unanimous on the subject of the desirability of free trade. Of course, complete unanimity is hardly ever possible, and every once in a while there have been some deviations from the straight and narrow path. Almost always, those deviations have reflected not a disagreement with the fundamental message of Adam Smith, not a disagreement that in the good world free trade would be the best of all possible courses, but they have tended to reflect special circumstances of the time. Time and again, economists, in my opinion, have erred when they have proposed second-best solutions in the area where they are experts, namely economics, because of predictions they make about political feasibility in an area where they are not experts. For the case of Great Britain, from the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 to the First World War, when for nearly a century Britain had complete free trade with no tariffs whatsoever on anything, except for that case, tariffs have been widespread. Why is it that you have the professional agreement on the one side and observed practice on the other, which departs so sharply from that agreement? The political reason is fairly straightforward. The political reason is that the interests that press for protection are concentrated. The people who are harmed by protection are spread and diffused. Indeed, the very language shows the political pressure. We call a tariff a protective measure. It does protect. It protects the consumer very well against one thing. It protects the consumer against low prices. And yet we call it protection. Each of us tends to produce a single product. We tend to buy 1,001 products. If we impose a tariff on steel or restrict imports of steel in other ways, the people who benefit are visible and clear and available and apparent. They have a very strong interest to press for restraints in that respect. The interest of the rest of us is very diffuse. Each of us will pay a few pennies more. We don't have the same interest to oppose it. If I may take a much more extreme case, which you may think does not come under the heading of protection, but yet does. We have a program of subsidizing the merchant marine, the maritime industry. That is really protection, because what we're doing is taking measures to prevent the use of foreign ships, that is, of importing the services of transporting goods. Those measures to benefit the merchant marine through shipbuilding subsidies, through operating subsidies, and so on, involve a total expenditure each year of roughly $600 million. That amounts to about $15,000 per year for each of the 25,000 people who is affected. You may be sure that they have every incentive to spend a lot of money on lobbying, on giving contributions to political candidates and so on to see that continue. But $600 million, the population of 200 million people, that's $3 apiece for each of us. Which one of us is going to go to Washington and lobby our congressman to avoid that extra $3 of taxes? You have a relatively small group of people who regard themselves as having much at stake, and therefore they are able to be more effective politically than the diffused consumer interest.
I'll be the greatest jobs president that God ever created. I'll take them back from China, from Japan, from Mexico. Ford is building a $2.5 billion factory, car plant, manufacturing plant for cars, trucks, and parts in Mexico.
How do you keep them?
You put a penalty on, a tariff or whatever you call it, and believe me, China's doing it to us. China dumps all their stuff with us, and I'm not complaining about that, but I have friends that are manufacturers. They cannot get their product into China. So if they're going to do it to us, we have to do it to them.
And they'll say, but then my car is going to cost more for your people.
No, you know what? They're going to make cars here. And maybe a person will buy fewer cars over the course of a lifetime. Who cares? If you look at what countries like China are doing to this country, they are eating our lunch. We're building China. We are really building China because everything we make is made in China or other countries. It's not made here. We don't make things anymore. We don't make, as an example, I ordered thousands of windows the other week, a couple of weeks ago. They're made in China. I said, does anybody make windows like in this country, in North Carolina, in Alabama, in Oregon, in places that used to make windows? They don't make them anymore. We're building China by ordering all of their products.
One of the things that baffles me is the extent to which people regard the trade deficit as a bad thing. Let's go back. The Japanese have a very large trade deficit. They have a surplus, from their point of view, a deficit from, what is it, 50 billion? Now, what have they been doing with that $50 billion over the last 10 years?
Giving it to us.
They've been making Americans rich. They've been buying golf courses at inflated prices. They've been buying property at inflated prices. Almost every one of their investments has gone sour. How have we been hurt by that? When I look at legal legislation, it almost always seems to me that legislation is enacted to benefit a small group at the expense of a large group. Free trade is a way of benefiting a large group at the expense of a small group. But politically, a small group always speaks with a bigger voice. If you were to take a referendum in this country, take a free trade issue, take any free trade issue you want. Suppose at the time one of my heroes, Mr. Reagan, made the great mistake of going along with voluntary import quotas on Japanese cars. Suppose you had a referendum of all automobile users in the United States, which said, are you willing to pay $2,000 extra a car in order to retain a few extra jobs in Detroit, in Michigan, in the automobile industry? Do you really think you would have gotten an overwhelming vote in favor of that?
When was the last time anybody saw us beating, let's say, China in a trade deal? They kill us. I beat China all the time. All the time. When did we beat Japan at anything? They send their cars over by the millions. And what do? When was the last time you saw a Chevrolet in Tokyo? It doesn't exist, folks.
If we have more free trade, we benefit. Look, well, are you worse off
to the extent
because Japan is more productive? On the contrary. If Japan is more productive, they have goods and services that you can buy from them at better prices, and they have more money, and more resources to buy goods and services from us or to invest in our country.
At least they got our dollars they got to do something with.
They got to do something. What are they going to do with the dollars?
We have a huge trade imbalance with many countries. But if you use China as an example, they're eating our lunch. When people talk about free trade, like you just said, oh, that's tariff, well, I don't mind a tariff on a country that's got billions and billions of dollars of surplus. We are rebuilding China. We're rebuilding China because we order so much. We're so big. We're ordering so much product from them.
The key, the reason why people are so mixed up, in my opinion, about free trade, there are two reasons. One is the propaganda from the producers. But the other is that they don't recognize the role of a floating exchange rate as something. Suppose for a moment, in the vision that people give, that everything in Japan was cheaper than everything in the United States. Okay? And so we want to buy all of Japan. They're willing to sell us. And they get dollars. But they don't want to buy anything in the United States because we're all too expensive. What are they going to do with those dollars? They're going to try to buy yen. How can they buy yen? Only by offering a better price for yen. But as they offer a better price for yen, the Japanese goods get more expensive, and the U.S. goods get less expensive. You can't compare costs between countries. The costs here are in dollars, the costs there are in yen, and which is cheaper depends on what the exchange rate is. And the exchange rate balances moves in such a way as to make sure that everybody who wants to get dollars can get them, everybody who wants to get yens can get them.
You would impose tariffs on some products like 35% on Ford cars made in Mexico. The Wall Street Journal says that you are running as, quote, the most anti-trade candidate since Herbert Hoover.
Okay, so here's the story. First of all, the Wall Street Journal was bought for $5 billion. It's now worth $500 million, okay? They don't have to tell me what to do.
The U.S. has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems.
The reason why Japan has had a balance of payment surplus has nothing to do with all the nonsense you hear about dumping and all the rest. It has to do with the fact that they've been saving a larger fraction of their income than we have, and they have to do something with their savings, and the opportunities for investing it at home are limited, and so the investments in the United States are more attractive to them. I assure you that if our rate of saving was to get to be higher than theirs, we'd have the surplus and they'd have the deficit.
In my opinion, you tax China. China is taking advantage of this country unbelievably. Now, I say you put a 25% tax on everything that's made in China.
That's a tariff.
That creates, and you know what? And then
a trade war.
That's right. And you know what? I'd love to have how are they going to retaliate?
Well, you know how much loans, how much money we owe China right now?
1 year of this tax and we don't owe them anything. 1 year of this tax and we don't owe them anything. Well,
I want to tell you the best argument I've ever heard for free trade. And this comes from Henry George. Henry George was a single taxer who wrote Progress and Poverty, the great book, a bestseller of the 1890s. He wrote once, it's a very interesting thing, in time of war, we blockade our enemies in order to prevent them from getting goods from us. In time of peace, we do to ourselves by tariffs what we do to our enemy in time of war.